We're at session number 14 in our online Bible study. We're looking today at the last of the 9 plagues, the third plague in the third trio. We have called it the plague of darkness. There's something significant about the notion of darkness. Well, this is as we said, the final plague in the final trio, the final plague before the Passover showdown. And there will be no warning for Pharaoh since this is the third plague in that trio. There'll be no grace period for him to think things over. God will speak to Moses. Moses will obey. And here's what God's instruction to Moses looked like, beginning in verse 21 of chapter 10. The Lord said to Moses, "Extend your hand toward the heaven so that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness that can be felt." We can almost be certain that Moses' rod or staff will be in his hand when he extends it. We're not told that, of course, but it's a pretty good supposition. Yahweh promised that darkness would be so palpable that you could cut it with a knife. If you've ever been deep in a cave or a cavern and turned off all light, you'd have experienced this kind of darkness. It's when you do that, and I've done it at Carlsbad Cavern in New Mexico. It's absolutely impossible to see anything, even your hand 6 inches in front of your face. You cannot see to move safely. You can't see anything. You can't see another individual. You're essentially imprisoned by the darkness, and you have to stay put. Moses obeyed God's command, as he's been doing during this entire plague sequence. Remember, he's at that obedience, walking according to God's will stage of his life. Excuse me. Verse 22. So Moses extended his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all of the land of Egypt. Now get this, for 3 days. No one could see another person. No one could rise from his place for 3 days. You're confined to your house for 3 days. But the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. So, what do we got? 72 hours of isolating, house confining darkness. Did you think COVID-19 quarantine was isolated? Well, at least the darkness didn't amplify that isolation. You could turn on lights, you could move around, but you may have had some limitations. Now, the darkness that we're speaking of here in Exodus may have had an accomplice, a natural cause subject to God's command. In the spring, for example, near the vernal equinox, when spring begins, in late March generally, Egypt experiences a 50-day wind known as a Khamsin, Khamsin. That wind comes off the Sahara Desert southwest of Egypt. And during that 50 days, for 2 or 3 days, the wind can be sufficiently strong to pick up dust and sand and other debris that's left on the ground. And when that happens, it makes things, visibility in particular, very difficult, if not impossible. That would be especially true in this case. Recall that the hail and the locust left the ground devoid of vegetation, so there's nothing to hold the soil down. If it's been hot, it's been dry, and there's no vegetation, It just increases the ability of wind to pick up dust and sand. Even though the sun was shining, the sun was obscured so badly that it became dark. Dust and sand and darkness make a very uncomfortable and claustrophobic setting. If you've been in a sandstorm called a haboob, Haboob, and I have, in Texas and New Mexico, you can also find it in Arizona. If you'd been caught in one of those, you'd understand what the meaning is here. Visibility goes to virtually zero. It may not be totally black, but you won't have any visibility because of the sand. Your eyes are vulnerable to the blowing sand. You can't stand facing it with your eyes open. Breathing is challenging because you're going to suck in sand, dust, whatever if you're not careful. So the safest course of action is halt all movement. Stay put. If you've got shelter and you can get to it, okay, but you don't want to do too much moving around. And by the way, in such a sandstorm, the lights in your car are of absolutely no value. All they do is they look 6 inches ahead into the sand and the dust that's there. Light gets reflected right back in your eyes. Light does not help you to see. Fortunately, those events in the Southwest are of very short length, just generally a few minutes, sometimes longer, but generally quite short. Or how about were you here in, was it 1981 when Mount St. Helens erupted? There was darkness. I can remember being in Spokane Valley, and somebody said Mount St. Helens just erupted and there's ash in the sky. I said, no problem. That's 250 miles away. I've got time to get home. By the time I got home, it was pitch black on an otherwise Sunday afternoon. Not only was it pitch black and you couldn't see without lights, it was hard to see through the falling ash. And the ash was abrasive. It ruined a lot of car engines. While the darkness didn't last for days, the after effects of the ash certainly did. For example, you may have had to shovel ash off your roof, thinking that those several inches of ash can get very, very heavy when it rains. So, one more time, though, notice the Israelites are protected again. It wasn't dark in Goshen, they had all the light they wanted. God's showing Pharaoh again, you can't protect the Egyptians, but I can protect the Hebrews. That exemption, by the way, of not having the darkness over Goshen reminded me of one May Day a long time ago. In days past, some of you probably not old enough to know this, on May 1st, individuals distributed cupcake-sized baskets called May baskets. You distributed them to your friends. You didn't tell them about it. You left the small baskets of goodies on the front porch or the stoops of the house if it just had a concrete front steps or something. But you left them there in the friends' houses and expected them to eventually find it, and they'd know who it came from. One time, though, when that happened, there was a report of a tornado that went through this town. It ripped up a house completely, tore it up, blew stuff to kingdom come, but on the front stoop was a May basket that was left undisturbed. The tornado tore up the house 2, 3 feet away, but left the May basket not even tipped over. And that looks like to me that God did something similar with the Kamsin. He said, okay, it's going to be limited and it won't mess with Goshen. So it's another example of God using natural events to carry out his judgments. And notice in the scriptures, darkness is more often a divine judgment. It represents a divine judgment more often than not. Okay, so this is going to be a paralyzing darkness that is a judgment on Egypt, a divine judgment. In addition, Ra, the sun god, was one of the two major gods of Egypt that we spoke of earlier. Hapi was the other one. So here you have the sun god with sun totally obscured by sun, dust, whatever it was that God caused the sun to be obscured by. Ra, of absolutely no help to the Egyptians at this point. He could neither stop God's blocking of the sun nor prevent it, nor even do anything about it when it happened. Then, in addition, we mentioned that Pharaoh is considered some form of God, a God whose purpose it was to maintain order in his universe. Well, the Egyptians effectively considered Pharaoh a son of Ra, even the human embodiment of Ra. So here is the human embodiment of the sun god, and he is impotent. There's nothing he can do about it. So this is a final climactic blow to Egyptian theology. No Egyptian god nor Pharaoh could stand against the power and sovereignty of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, it seems maybe Pharaoh's beginning to get the picture. Let's continue in verse 24. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, "Go serve the Lord." Is he relenting? We'll see. "Only your flocks and your herds will be detained. Even your families may go with you." Remember last time he says the men can go, but that's all. Well, now he said men, women, children, you can all go, but not your livestock. While he seems to be relenting, he's still trying to maintain control, telling the Hebrews what they can and they cannot do. Yeah, they can go, the men can go, the women can go, the children can go, the livestock stay. Okay, but God has a different plan, of course, a plan that included sacrifices when the Israelis go to worship him in this festival of sorts that they were talking about the whole time. But remember now, this is going to be a festival that they have never held before. They do not have a clue what sacrifices are going to be required. They don't know what's going to be required of them, except it is a worship service of some sort. So Moses essentially says to Pharaoh, "Okay, Pharaoh, we need to make sacrifices, but we need our livestock. We don't know what we're going to need. We don't know whatever it will be." But he says in verse 25, Moses said, "Will you also provide us with sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may present them to the Lord our God?" In other words, he's saying, "Okay, Pharaoh, we leave our livestock. You're going to take care of giving us what we need for any sacrifices that might come up, and we don't even know what that'll be." It's doubtful that Moses waited for a reply. In verse 26, it continues, Moses saying, "Our livestock must also go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. For we must take the animals to serve the Lord our God. Until we arrive there, we do not know what we must use to serve the Lord. So he's saying again, we don't know what that's going to be. We have to take everything. Moses is pushing the envelope, all right. He's shoving the king around to a bit in this argument, and he's holding fast to God's instructions. He considers that more important than whatever Pharaoh can do. But God intervened once again to set the stage for a really big finish. Verse 27, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He was not willing to release them. God closed the door several plagues ago by hardening Pharaoh's heart. He's not going to open that door. That door will remain permanently shut. Pharaoh is at a place now where he cannot respond positively to the will of God. He's been too long in opposition. So Pharaoh reacted a little bit stronger than you'd expect for somebody, except he's showing hatred for Yahweh and Yahweh's servants. Verse 28, Pharaoh said to him, Moses, go from me, watch out for yourself, don't appear before me again, for when you see my face, you will die. In other words, Pharaoh's saying, you get in my face again and you're a dead man. Well, that's not the first time Moses has been under a death sentence by Pharaoh, is it? 40 years ago, when he was out of God's will, he was running from a death sentence imposed by the Pharaoh. Now, here he is doing God's work, God's way, in God's time, totally obedient to God, and the same thing happens. So once again, we're essentially told that just because you're in God's will does not mean everything runs smoothly. So Moses, on the other hand, though, but in responding, is cool, composed. He's confident. He's learned from his experiences just what God is capable of doing for his people. Verse 29, Moses said, as you wish, I won't see your face again. He's not going to run. He's not going to hide, but Pharaoh's not going to see his face again. That's what Moses claimed. Now, unknowingly, Pharaoh really has just signed his own death warrant. Because, in fact, after the Passover, he will pay the ultimate price with his life. So here's a takeaway or two. First, God cares for his own. He's protected the Hebrew people through this entire mess. Second, nothing and no one is capable of keeping God from doing what he has decreed. Remember in Isaiah, we saw some verses. God said, I'm God, I'm the only God. What I say will stand. What I say, I will do. And no one will stop me. Again, third, the darkness signals divine judgment. We see that all the way through the Bible. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to take time next time to talk about how these plagues show up in other spots in Scripture and how darkness it permeates as a form of judgment all the way through Scripture. And our final takeaway, confidence in God comes by faith bolstered through experiencing Him at work around and through you. That's what Moses has learned. He's learned that no matter what the situation is, if he stands fast in God, obedient to God's will, he's going to be okay. He's learned that. We need to learn that. During the 9 plagues, what have we heard about and in relation to the Hebrew people? Really only one thing. They were protected by God. They were apparently passive in this whole mess. Well, that's about to change. When we get to the Passover and the beginning of the Exodus, we're going to find that the Hebrew peoples become